Behind the heavy doors of the merchant mansions of pre-revolutionary Tomsk lay secrets that were not to be spoken of aloud. Freemasons, whose presence in distant Siberia seemed incredible, created a whole network of secret lodges here. Decembrists, gold miners, high-ranking officials, all of them were bound by invisible ties of brotherhood. Their traces can still be seen on the facades of old buildings if you know the language of secret symbols. The story you are about to hear will lift the veil on one of the most mysterious pages of Siberia's past. If you are interested in the mysteries of history, secret societies, and hidden pages of the past, subscribe to our channel and like this video. In the comments, we invite you to discuss a controversial question. Were the Freemasons secret benefactors of society, the driving force behind enlightenment and progress? Or did their true goals remain hidden even from most members of the lodges? Share your opinion. At the beginning of the 18th century, a wave of mysterious events swept through the cities of the Russian Empire, about which ordinary people could only guess behind the closed doors of wealthy mansions. The Masonic movement, which came from Europe, rapidly conquered the minds of the educated elite. The first reliable evidence of the appearance of Freemasons in Russia dates back to 1731, when the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of London appointed Captain John Phillips as Provincial Grand Master for the entire empire. But this was only the beginning of a story that, a century later, would reach its invisible threads to the most remote corners of the country. At that time, Siberia seemed like the end of the world, a place of exile and hard labor, where people who were unwelcome to the authorities were sent. However, it was here, among the endless expanses and severe frosts, that Masonic ideas gained particular strength. After all, what could be more attractive to exiled intellectuals than a brotherhood of like-minded people united by the high ideals of freedom, equality, and enlightenment? Information about Freemasonry in 18th century Siberia is extremely scarce and contradictory, as if someone had deliberately erased the traces of the secret society. Until 1818, historians can only speak of isolated Freemasons who lived or were exiled to these lands. One of the first known Siberian Freemasons was Ivan Selifontov, the Governor-General of Irkutsk and Kolyma, a man of enormous power and influence. His connection to the secret order was carefully concealed, but those in the know were aware of his membership in the Brotherhood. No less mysterious is the story of Alexander Radishchev, the great Russian enlightener who spent the years 1791 to 1796 in exile in Siberia. Although there is no direct evidence of his membership in Masonic lodges, many researchers find clear traces of Masonic philosophy and symbolism in his Siberian notes. But were these just coincidences or carefully encrypted messages for the initiated? Of particular interest is a report by the notorious informer Bulgarin, in which he claimed that followers of the enlightener Novikov planned to establish a small republic in Siberia near the border with China, which would then serve as a model for the transformation of the whole of Russia. For a long time, this report was considered a ridiculous fabrication, born of the authorities' paranoid fear of secret societies. However, modern historians are finding more and more indirect evidence in the archives that such plans were indeed discussed in closed Masonic circles. Perhaps the idea of creating a utopian society in the vastness of Siberia did not seem as fantastic then as it does now. 18th century Siberia was a unique space for social experiments. The vast distances, weak control by the central government, and mix of different cultures and peoples created a special atmosphere of freedom that did not exist in the European part of the empire. It was here that people with radical ideas who dreamed of rebuilding society on new, just principles could find refuge. Masonic lodges became the ideal structure for uniting such people, providing them not only with a philosophical foundation, but also with a conspiratorial organization. We can only guess what secret meetings took place in Siberian cities at that time. The year 1818 was a turning point in the history of Freemasonry in Siberia. On August 30th, the first Masonic lodge with the symbolic name Eastern Light in the east of Tomsk was officially founded in the city of Tomsk. This event was not accidental and was not isolated from the all-Russian Masonic structures. The Tomsk Lodge became part of the influential Union Grand Lodge of Astraea in St. Petersburg, which immediately gave it status and legitimacy in the eyes of the Russian Masonic community. But why was Tomsk chosen for this historic step? And who was behind this decision? At the beginning of the 19th century, Tomsk was one of the most important administrative centers in Siberia. The city served as a link between European Russia and the far eastern reaches of the empire. It was a hub for important trade routes, a center of wealth for gold miners and merchants, and the location of provincial institutions. The city's educated elite, high-ranking officials, military officers, and successful entrepreneurs sought not only material well-being, but also spiritual development. The Masonic Lodge offered exactly what was so lacking in the harsh Siberian world: a space for philosophical discussion, moral improvement, and brotherly fellowship. The Eastern Light Lodge operated according to the ancient English system of Schroeder, using Russian instead of the traditional Latin or French formulations. This was a fundamental decision that emphasized the national character of Siberian Freemasonry. Meetings were held regularly, on the first and third Thursday of each month, following a strict ritual developed over centuries of Masonic tradition. The lodge's official seal depicted a torch in a triangle with descending ribbons and the date of its founding. Each element of this image had a deep symbolic meaning. The torch represented the light of knowledge dispelling the darkness of ignorance. The triangle symbolized the trinity of the divine principle, and the ribbons signified the connection between the heavenly and earthly worlds. The organizational structure of the Tomsk Lodge strictly followed the Masonic hierarchy. At the head was the managing master, or master of the chair, who was Tomsk Vice-Governor Nikolai Gorlov. His appointment to this position was far from accidental. As the second-in-command in the provincial administration, he had sufficient authority to protect the lodge from possible persecution. Major General Christian Triblut, a high-ranking military officer whose authority in army circles was unquestionable, was elected deputy master. The first overseer was veterinarian Fyodor Gonigman, a man of science and practice, and the second overseer was Osip Balyura Kondratiev. Ivan Konovalov was appointed secretary, keeper of all the secrets and protocols of the lodge. The location of the lodge's meetings was carefully guarded from prying eyes. The brothers gathered in a specially prepared room, where every detail of the interior had symbolic meaning. The walls were decorated with Masonic emblems, a compass and square, the all-seeing eye in a triangle, and the columns of Jachin and Boaz. The floor was laid with black and white checkered tiles, symbolizing the duality of the world: good and evil, light and darkness, the material and the spiritual. Special items were used during the rituals: the master's silver hammer, the supervisor's staffs, and ritual swords. The atmosphere of mystery and sublimity was intended to put the participants in a philosophical mood and encourage spiritual improvement. The Tomsk Lodge's connection with the St. Petersburg Astraea was maintained through local representatives. At first, this position was held by Nikolai Kusov, who was later replaced by Count Vasily Tolstoy. These people served as a link between the capital and Siberian Freemasonry, transmitting directives, philosophical texts, and ritual instructions. But did this connection serve other, more secret purposes? Was the Siberian Lodge part of a larger plan to spread Masonic ideas throughout the empire? These questions remain unanswered to this day. Among the founders of the Tomsk Masonic Lodge, a special place is occupied by Gavril Stepanovich Batenkov, a man whose fate became a symbol of the tragic intertwining of high ideals and harsh political reality. Born into the family of an ensign in the local battalion, Batenkov was a true Siberian, raised in Tobolsk, and familiar with the harshness and grandeur of this region from childhood. His journey from a provincial youth to a prominent engineer and secret revolutionary is a fascinating story, full of unexpected twists and turns. But how did a simple Siberian end up at the very center of the Masonic movement and the Decembrist conspiracy? Batenkov received a brilliant education. After attending the Tobolsk People's School, he graduated from the Military Orphanage Department of the St. Petersburg Cadet Corps, and then the prestigious St. Petersburg Institute of Transport. It was in the capital, among educated young people eagerly absorbing European ideas of enlightenment and freedom, that Batenkov first came into contact with Freemasonry. He was accepted into the Masonic Lodge Chosen Michael, one of the most influential in St. Petersburg. There he met people who would later play a key role in Russian history, the future Decembrists, who dreamed of liberating the country from autocracy and serfdom. In 1817, fate brought Batenkov back to Siberia. He was appointed engineer and served as assistant chief of the Siberian District of Communications in Tobolsk. On March 23rd of that year, he arrived in Tomsk, where he became actively involved in improving the city. Under his leadership, a bridge was built across the Ushaika River. A spring was arranged to supply residents with drinking water, and streets were improved. Batenkov was not just an official performing his duties, but a true enlightener who sought to improve the lives of ordinary people. However, his main project in Tomsk was the creation of a Masonic lodge. Batenkov brought not only engineering knowledge from St. Petersburg, but also Masonic ideas, rituals, and connections with influential brothers. It was his energy and organizational skills that allowed him to gather a group of like-minded people in Tomsk and found the Eastern Light Lodge. He read his own poems at soirees in the homes of the Tomsk elite, wrote poetry, and led philosophical discussions on the nature of the state and society and the paths of Russia's development. His home became the center of the city's intellectual life, a place where not only Masonic mysteries were discussed, but also political issues that concerned the progressive part of Russian society. In the summer of 1819, Batenkov left Tomsk to participate in the senatorial audit of Siberia conducted by Mikhail Speransky. This was not a simple administrative check, but a large-scale transformation of the entire system of governance of a huge region. Speransky, himself a prominent Freemason and reformer, highly valued the abilities of the young engineer. A close relationship developed between them that went beyond the scope of their official duties. They discussed not only current administrative issues, but also profound philosophical problems concerning the structure of an ideal state. It is no coincidence that it was in Nizhnudinsk in 1819 that Speransky wrote his Remarks on the Origin of Freemasonry, a treatise revealing his understanding of Masonic ideals. Batenkov's own Masonic memoirs, later published by the historian Pipin, are a unique document that provides an inside look at the activities of the Siberian Lodge. They contain not only descriptions of rituals and philosophical discussions, but also reflections on the role of Freemasonry in the transformation of Russia. Batenkov saw Freemasonry not simply as a mystical brotherhood, but as a tool for educating the people and preparing the ground for future political reforms. His path from Freemasonry to the Decembrist movement was logical and natural. But how did this story end for Batenkov himself? And what price did he pay for his convictions? Mikhail Mikhailovich Speransky is a name that cannot be ignored when talking about Freemasonry in Siberia in the early 19th century. An outstanding statesman, reformer, and author of projects to transform the Russian Empire, Speransky was also a prominent figure in the Russian Masonic movement. Many historians consider his appointment as Governor-General of Siberia in 1818 to be not just an administrative decision, but part of a larger plan. Is it possible that the highest Masonic circles viewed Siberia as a testing ground for implementing their social ideas under the guise of official reforms. Speransky arrived in Siberia with broad powers to audit and transform the entire system of regional administration. Abuse by local officials had reached incredible proportions. Corruption permeated all levels of government, and the local population suffered from arbitrariness and lawlessness. The new governor-general launched a large-scale reform program that affected all spheres of life: the administrative structure, the judicial system, taxation, and the status of indigenous peoples. But in parallel with his official activities, Speransky carried out other secret work related to the spread of Masonic ideas among the Siberian elite. It was in Siberia, in the city of Nizhnoudinsk, in 1819, that Speransky wrote his famous treatise, Remarks on the Origin of Freemasonry. This document was not intended for the general public. It was distributed only among initiated brothers. In it, Speransky outlined his understanding of Masonic philosophy, traced the history of the movement from the legendary builders of Solomon's Temple to modern lodges, and explained the symbolic meaning of Masonic rituals. But most importantly, he justified the role of Freemasonry in educating society and preparing it for future transformations. Was this treatise a kind of action plan for Siberian Freemasons? Speransky's relationship with Batenkov went far beyond the official relationship between a boss and a subordinate. Speransky immediately recognized in the young engineer a kindred spirit, a man of high ideals and abilities. From 1819 to 1821, Batenkov was in the immediate circle of the Governor-General, participating in the development and implementation of reforms. Their communication was not limited to business matters. They spent long evenings in philosophical conversations about the nature of the state, the ideal structure of society, and the role of the enlightened elite in the historical process. Masonic ideas served as the basis for these discussions, providing a language and conceptual framework for discussing acute political issues. Speransky's influence on the development of the Tomsk Masonic Lodge cannot be overestimated. With such a high-ranking patron, the lodge received informal protection from possible persecution by conservative circles, which were always suspicious of secret societies. Speransky was not a formal member of the Tomsk Lodge. His status and position did not allow it. But his spiritual presence was felt at all meetings. The brothers knew that their activities were approved by the Governor-General himself, which gave them confidence and legitimacy. It can be said that Speransky created a kind of Masonic protectorate in Siberia, where the ideas of enlightenment and reform could develop relatively freely. However, the political situation in the empire was changing. The liberal mood of the early years of Alexander I's reign was replaced by a growing reaction. The authorities were increasingly wary of any form of social self-organization, seeing it as a threat to the existing order. Masonic lodges came under particular suspicion because of their secrecy and international connections. Even an influential Freemason such as Speransky could not completely protect the Siberian lodges from the impending persecution. It was only a matter of time before secret societies were banned throughout the empire. But before that happened, the Tomsk Lodge managed to leave a deep mark on the history of the region. The membership of the Tomsk Masonic Lodge Eastern Light represented a cross-section of the Siberian elite of the time. Unlike the lodges in the capital, where the hereditary aristocracy with ancient titles predominated, the Siberian Lodge was more democratic in character. It was a gathering place for people who had achieved their status through their own hard work and talent. Middle and high-ranking officials, military officers, doctors, and teachers. But especially interesting is the presence of merchants and gold miners, representatives of a class that traditionally kept aloof from intellectual movements. What attracted Siberian entrepreneurs to the Masonic Brotherhood? And what role did they play in the lodge? Sources mention the merchants Christopher and Alexander Popov among the members of the lodge. The Popov dynasty was one of the most influential merchant families in Tomsk, building their capital on the trade of furs, grain, and other goods. For such people, Joining the Masonic Lodge meant not only participating in philosophical debates, but also expanding their business contacts and entering the circle of decision-makers. The Masonic Brotherhood provided merchants with a unique opportunity to communicate on equal terms with the governor or general, overcoming class barriers. However, it would be simplistic to reduce their interest in Freemasonry to purely pragmatic considerations. An even more significant figure was the gold industrialist Ivan Astashev. At the beginning of the 19th century, a real gold rush began in Siberia. The discovery of rich deposits in the Altai and Yenisei Mountains attracted many adventurers and entrepreneurs. Astashev was one of the first to organize industrial gold mining and became rich from it. His wealth was fabulous even by the standards of the capital's aristocracy. But what could interest such a man in Masonic philosophy, with its preaching of spiritual perfection and contempt for material goods? Perhaps the answer lies in the special atmosphere of Siberian entrepreneurship at that time. Merchants and industrialists who achieved success in the harsh conditions of the region were extraordinary people with broad horizons and ambitions that went beyond the simple accumulation of wealth. They felt a responsibility to society and sought not only profit, but also respect and recognition for their contribution to the development of the region. The Masonic Lodge provided just such an opportunity. Through participation in charitable and educational activities, merchants could realize their social ambitions. Donations to schools, hospitals, and libraries became an integral part of Masonic practice. Officials made up the majority of the lodge members. In addition to the leaders already mentioned, the lists include the names of Johann Niemeyer, Ivan Ivanov, Karl Treiblut, and Fyodor Gorakov. These people faced the reality of the Russian bureaucratic machine on a daily basis and saw its shortcomings, corruption, and arbitrariness. Masonic ideals of service to society, honesty, and justice contrasted sharply with the realities surrounding them. The lodge became a space for them where they could at least mentally construct an ideal society, discuss what power should be like, and what principles should underlie state governance. Were these discussions the first steps toward more radical ideas that would lead to the Decembrist uprising a few years later? The social composition of the Tomsk Lodge made it a unique phenomenon in the history of Russian Freemasonry. Here, the very mixing of classes that the Enlighteners dreamed of took place. Nobles, officials, merchants, and doctors united in a brotherhood of equals, where titles and wealth gave way to moral qualities and intellect. This experiment in social equality was impossible in the normal life of Russian society with its rigid class hierarchy. But within the walls of the lodge, behind closed doors, a miracle took place. People of different classes addressed each other as brother, shared their thoughts and feelings, and sought the truth together. Perhaps it was this experience of equality and brotherhood that frightened the authorities the most? Irkutsk, the capital of eastern Siberia, is a city with a special history and atmosphere. At the beginning of the 19th century, it had its own Masonic Lodge, whose history is shrouded in even greater mystery than that of the Tomsk Eastern Star. Very little documentary evidence of it has survived, which allows for a wide variety of assumptions about its activities and composition. All that is known is that the lodge was headed by a mysterious French emigrant named Leroy, and that its members included other Frenchmen and exiled Poles. What brought these people to a distant Siberian city, and what secrets did they bring with them from revolutionary Europe? The French Revolution of 1789 gave rise to a wave of emigration from France. Thousands of people fled to neighboring countries to escape the terror. Russia accepted many French aristocrats, officers, and intellectuals. Some of them ended up in Siberia, entering Russian service or engaging in entrepreneurship. Leroy was one such emigrant. Very little is known about his past, but the very fact that he headed the Masonic Lodge in Irkutsk speaks to his high status among his brothers. French Freemasonry had its own characteristics that distinguished it from the English and Scottish branches. It was more politicized and more radical in its views. Did the French Freemasons bring ideas to Siberia that would later materialize in revolutionary movements? The presence of Poles in the Irkutsk Lodge was also no coincidence. After the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century, thousands of Poles found themselves in exile in the Russian Empire. Many of them were educated people, participants in the national liberation movement, bearers of European ideas of freedom and independence. For them, the Masonic Lodge became not just a philosophical club, but also a way to preserve their national identity, maintain ties with each other, and discuss plans for the future liberation of their homeland. The Russian authorities always viewed Polish exiles with suspicion, seeing them as potential troublemakers. But could they have imagined that a political organization was hiding under the guise of a mystical brotherhood? In addition to the official Masonic Lodge, there were educational and charitable societies in Irkutsk and other Siberian cities that were similar to the Masons in spirit and organizational principles. They had characteristic names: Friends of Freedom and Light of Reason. Formally, these societies were not Masonic lodges and did not hold ritual meetings. Their activities focused on organizing libraries, schools, and public lectures. However, many of their members were also members of Masonic lodges, and the ideology of these societies was fully consistent with the Masonic philosophy of enlightenment. Were these societies a kind of facade covering more profound Masonic activities? Irkutsk was an important trading center at that time, connecting Russia with China. Caravans carrying tea, silk, and other Oriental goods passed through the city. Foreign merchants were constantly present here: Chinese, Persians, and Bukharans. The ethnic and cultural diversity of the city created a special atmosphere that distinguished it from other Siberian cities. In this environment, Masonic ideas of universal brotherhood among people of all nations and religions found fertile ground. Perhaps this is why the Irkutsk Lodge attracted such a diverse membership: French, Poles, Russians, and perhaps even representatives of Eastern peoples. After 1820, when the persecution of Masonic lodges began, the documents of the Irkutsk Lodge were destroyed or securely hidden. The history of the French and Polish Masonic Society in Irkutsk has become a legend, overgrown with speculation and fantastic details. Some local historians claim that Masonic symbols are still preserved on the facades of old Irkutsk buildings. But is this really the case? Or do people see secret signs where there are none? One thing is certain: the Masonic movement left a deep mark on the history of Irkutsk, traces of which can still be found today if you know where to look. The 14th of December, 1825, changed the history of Russia forever. The uprising on Senate Square in St. Petersburg was suppressed, 5 leaders were hanged, and dozens of participants were sent to hard labor in Siberia. Among the Decembrists were many Freemasons, people who had been educated in Masonic lodges and had absorbed the ideas of freedom, equality, and constitutional government. Their arrival in Siberia created a unique situation. People of the highest level of initiation, members of the most influential lodges in the capital, arrived in a region where Masonic traditions already existed. How did Siberia welcome these prisoners of conscience, and what impact did they have on local society? The first groups of Decembrists began arriving in Irkutsk as early as 1826. At the Moscow gate of the city, there were real demonstrations in their honor, organized by members of the Irkutsk Masonic Lodge. It was a remarkable act of courage to openly express support for state criminals sentenced by the emperor himself. But the Masonic Brotherhood did not recognize state borders or political differences. The Decembrists were brothers who had fallen into trouble, and it was the duty of other brothers to support them. The authorities turned a blind eye to these demonstrations, not daring to openly repress respected members of the local community. Among the exiled Decembrists were Princes Sergei Volkonsky and Sergei Trubetskoy, both Freemasons of the highest degree of initiation, masters of lodges, and keepers of secret Masonic knowledge. Their arrival in Siberia was an event of enormous significance for the local Masonic community. Despite the official ban on Masonic lodges, which had been in effect since 1822, the Brotherhood continued to exist underground. Meetings were held secretly, without official protocols and documents, but Masonic ties were not broken. The Decembrist Freemasons became spiritual mentors for Siberian youth, passing on Masonic wisdom and revolutionary ideas. Gavril Batenkov, as a Decembrist and founder of the Tomsk Masonic Lodge, occupied a special place among the exiles. He was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor, which he served in the inhuman conditions of solitary confinement. 20 years in a solitary cell in the Alexeyevsky Ravelin of the Peter and Paul Fortress, without the right to communicate, with only one book, the Bible. It was one of the most severe sentences among the Decembrists. But even in these conditions, Batenkov did not break down, retaining his clarity of mind and loyalty to his ideals. In 1846, he was sent to settle in Tomsk, where he spent the rest of his life, becoming a legend for the local residents. The wives of the Decembrists, who followed their husbands to Siberia, were also in many cases connected to the Masonic movement through family traditions. Princess Maria Volkonskaya, Ekaterina Trubetskaya, and Alexandra Muravyova became symbols of sacrifice and loyalty. In Siberian exile, they organized schools for children and libraries, and helped the sick and needy. These activities were fully in line with Masonic principles of charity and education. Cultural centers formed around the homes of the Decembrists, where the local intelligentsia gathered, philosophical discussions were held, music was played, and books were read. The authorities viewed this with suspicion, but did not dare to openly repress aristocratic women. The influence of the Decembrists on Siberian society cannot be overestimated. They brought with them the high culture of the capital's salons, European education, and advanced scientific and philosophical ideas. Many of them were engaged in research on Siberia. They studied its geography, geology, ethnography, and history. Their work made an important contribution to the knowledge of the region. But even more important was their spiritual influence. Their example of steadfastness, loyalty to their convictions, and willingness to sacrifice everything for their ideals made a deep impression on the youth of Siberia. The seeds sown by the Decembrists Freemasons in Siberia would sprout in subsequent generations of revolutionaries. Walking through the old quarters of Siberian cities, an attentive observer may notice strange details on the facades of old mansions and public buildings. Geometric patterns that seem like simple decorations, round rose windows, triangular pediments with unusual proportions, columns with mysterious capitals. For most people, these are just architectural refinements of past centuries, but a knowledgeable person can easily recognize them as secret Masonic symbols. These stone messages have outlived their creators by centuries, silently testifying to the presence of Freemasons in pre-revolutionary Siberia. But how can we learn to read this stone language? And what can it tell us about the secret societies of the past? The main Masonic symbol is the compass and square, often depicted intertwined. The compass symbolizes the spiritual beginning, the striving for the heavenly, the ability to embrace the entire universe with thought. The square represents the material world, straightforwardness, and honesty in earthly matters. Their combination expresses the Masonic ideal of harmony between the spiritual and the material, between lofty thoughts and practical action. The letter G is often placed in the center of these instruments, which can mean God, geometry, or gnosis. This symbol was rarely depicted openly on Siberian buildings, but an experienced eye can find it in the decorative elements of the facades, where the compass and square are disguised as floral ornaments or geometric patterns. The triangle, or delta, is one of the oldest Masonic symbols. It represents the divine trinity, the triunity of the creative forces of the universe. In Masonic tradition, The all-seeing eye, surrounded by rays of light, is often placed inside the triangle. This symbol signifies the omniscience of the great architect of the universe, his presence in all human affairs, and the impossibility of hiding lies or injustice from him. On the facades of 19th-century mansions in Tomsk and Irkutsk, triangular pediments above windows and doors often contain this symbol, albeit in a veiled form. Sometimes it is simply a triangle with rays. Sometimes a rosette is placed inside it, which on closer inspection resembles a stylized eye. Columns play a special role in Masonic symbolism, dating back to the legend of the two columns of Solomon's temple, Jachin and Boaz. These columns represent opposite principles: strength and wisdom, activity and passivity, masculine and feminine. Between them lies the path of the seeker of truth, the path of the initiate striving for the light of knowledge. Many merchant mansions in Tomsk were built with paired columns at the entrance, which may not be just an architectural technique, but also a sign of the owner's membership in the Masonic Brotherhood. Particularly noteworthy are buildings where the columns have unusual capitals with geometric ornamentation, or where their number and arrangement follow certain proportions known in Masonic tradition. The black and white checkerboard floor is one of the most important elements of any Masonic lodge. It symbolizes the duality of the world, the struggle between light and darkness, good and evil, as well as the need for balance between opposites. In Siberian buildings, this motif was often used in the design of porches and floors in ceremonial halls. The mansions of wealthy Masonic merchants were distinguished by such floors in their main rooms. Modern restorers working with old buildings sometimes discover original 19th-century checkerboard floors under layers of later coverings, confirming the Masonic affiliation of the owners. The compass also has its own meaning in Masonic symbolism. It represents measure, moderation, the ability to define the boundaries of what is permissible, and to keep one's desires and passions under the control of reason. Masonic architects often use this tool as a decorative element, placing its images in the most unexpected places. On the cornices of buildings, you can find round medallions with geometric figures inscribed in them. These are veiled images of the Masonic compass. The arrangement of windows and doors on the facade, the ratio of the height and width of the building, the distances between decorative elements, all this could be subject not only to aesthetic, but also to symbolic considerations, understandable only to the initiated. The five-pointed star, or pentagram, is also found in Masonic symbolism, although less frequently than the main symbols. It symbolizes a person with outstretched arms and legs, a microcosm reflecting the macrocosm of the universe. In Russian Freemasonry of the 18th and 19th centuries, the pentagram was used in some of the higher degrees of initiation. On Siberian buildings, stars in the decor may have precisely this secret meaning. Interestingly, after the revolution, many of these buildings were used by the Soviet authorities, and the Masonic stars on their facades took on a completely new, communist interpretation, although they originally meant something completely different. Isn't this a historical paradox? How symbols of one secret idea served another? Masonic rituals have always been surrounded by an aura of deep secrecy. The oath of silence that each new member took was so serious that breaking it threatened not only expulsion from the lodge, but also the vengeance of the entire brotherhood. According to legend, traitors to Freemasonry faced terrible punishment, the details of which were kept strictly secret. That is why so few reliable descriptions of what happened at the closed meetings of Freemasons in Siberian cities have come down to us. Documents were destroyed, eyewitnesses remained silent, and only fragmentary evidence allows us to reconstruct the picture of the secret ceremonies that took place behind closed doors in Tomsk and Irkutsk mansions. Preparations for the lodge meeting began well in advance. The room had to be prepared in strict accordance with ritual requirements. The master's chair was placed in the east, elevated above the rest of the space. The first and second overseers' seats were located to the south and west. The floor was covered with black and white checkered fabric or carpet, if there was no permanent floor with such a pattern. The walls were decorated with Masonic emblems and allegorical images, each of which had a deep symbolic meaning. Lighting was provided exclusively by candles arranged in a specific pattern. The three main candles symbolized wisdom, strength, and beauty, the three pillars on which the Masonic temple rests. The atmosphere of mystery was enhanced by the subdued light, which created a play of shadows on the walls. The brothers gathered at the appointed hour, dressed in ritual garments. The basis of Masonic attire was an apron, or zapon, symbolizing the work of a mason and purity of thought. The apron was sewn from white leather or fabric and decorated with symbols depending on the degree of initiation of the owner. Apprentices wore simple white aprons, journeymen added blue elements, and masters were entitled to more elaborate decorations with gold embroidery. A sash was worn over the apron, the color and decorations of which also indicated the degree and position of the brother. The master of the chair had a special staff or hammer, a symbol of his authority to direct the work of the lodge. The overseers carried their staffs. The secretary had a pen and a book for recording, and the treasurer had the keys to the common treasury. The opening of the lodge's work was carried out according to a strict ritual, which varied depending on the system followed by the lodge. The Tomsk Lodge worked according to the Schroeder system, which used the Russian language and was adapted to Russian conditions. The master of the chair called the brothers to silence and attention with 3 blows of the hammer. This was followed by a dialogue between the master and the wardens, in which they confirmed that all those present were true Freemasons, that the room was securely guarded from the uninitiated, and that the brothers were ready for work. This dialogue was based on questions and answers using special terminology that was only understandable to the initiated. After the introductory part was completed, the master solemnly declared the lodge open, and the actual work began. The work of the lodge could include several elements. First, there were ceremonies for initiating new members or elevating existing members to higher degrees. The initiation ceremony was particularly solemn and made an indelible impression on the neophyte. The candidate was led to the doors of the temple blindfolded, wearing special clothing that demonstrated his lack of initiation. He knocked on the door 3 times, asking to be let in. After a ritual interrogation and receiving the consent of the brothers, he was led inside, still blindfolded. This was followed by symbolic trials, during which the candidate had to demonstrate his determination, courage, and fortitude. Then, at the climax of the ceremony, the blindfold was removed from his eyes, and he saw the temple for the first time in all its symbolic beauty, bathed in candlelight. This moment symbolized the transition from the darkness of ignorance to the light of knowledge. Secondly, philosophical conversations and discussions were held at the meetings. The brothers read reports on moral, philosophical, and scientific topics. They discussed issues such as the structure of society, ways to improve humanity, and the nature of good and evil. These discussions were conducted at a high intellectual level, with participants quoting ancient philosophers, contemporary thinkers, and sacred texts from various religions. The Masonic Lodge was a space for free thought, where it was possible to express ideas that in ordinary society could lead to accusations of free thinking or heresy. It was this intellectual freedom that made Masonic lodges so attractive to the educated elite. Thirdly, organizational issues were decided: the distribution of collected contributions to charity, the planning of educational events, and correspondence with other lodges. The closing of the proceedings took place with the same solemnity as the opening. After striking the gavel 3 times, the master declared the lodge closed, and the brothers dispersed, taking with them into the profane world an echo of the high spirituality they had experienced within the walls of the temple. How did these people feel as they left the ritual space and returned to the harsh Siberian reality? Did Masonic ideals help them in their daily lives, or did they remain only a beautiful philosophy? far from reality. Merchant dynasties formed the backbone of the Siberian economy in the 19th century. The names of the Sibiriakovs, Trapeznikovs, Balandins, Vostrotins, and Gromovs were well known not only in Tomsk and Irkutsk, but also in Moscow and even in European trade centers. These people made huge fortunes from the fur trade, gold mining, tea caravans, and forestry. But wealth was not an end in itself for them, but a means to achieve higher goals. Many representatives of merchant dynasties belonged to Masonic lodges, where they found spiritual guidance and philosophical justification for their activities. How did these people combine the pursuit of profit with Masonic ideals of selfless service to humanity? Was there a contradiction here? And if not, how did they resolve it? The Sibiriakov family is a classic example of a merchant dynasty associated with the Masonic movement. Their ancestor took his surname from the very region where he became wealthy, which underscores the family's deep connection to Siberia. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Sibiriakovs owned gold mines, fur trading posts, and trading houses in several cities. Their wealth was measured in millions of rubles, a fantastic sum for that time. However, the members of this family were known not only for their commercial successes, but also for their generous charity work. They built schools and hospitals, financed scientific expeditions, and supported artists and writers. This charitable activity was entirely in line with Masonic principles, and there is reason to believe that at least some members of the dynasty were initiated brothers. The Trapeznikovs, another influential merchant family, specialized in the gold industry. The discovery of rich gold deposits in Siberia in the early 19th century created a whole class of gold industrialists whose wealth grew at an incredible rate. The Trapeznikovs were among the leaders of this gold rush. But gold mining required not only capital, but also organizational skills, the ability to manage large teams of workers and solve complex technical problems. Education, broad-mindedness, and the ability to think strategically were all qualities that were cultivated in Masonic lodges. It is not surprising that many gold miners gravitated toward Freemasonry, finding in it business connections, an intellectual environment, and moral justification for their wealth through charity. The Balandins represented another type of merchant enterprise. They were involved in organizing tea caravans from China. The tea trade was one of the most profitable and risky ventures of the time. The caravans had to travel thousands of miles across the harsh Siberian expanses, overcome mountain passes, cross rivers, and endure frosts and blizzards. It required tremendous organizational skills and the ability to find common ground with representatives of different peoples: the Chinese, Mongols, Kazakhs, and local Siberian tribes. The Masonic ideals of universal brotherhood among people of all nations and religions were not an abstract philosophy here, but a practical guide to action. Merchant Freemasons saw representatives of other nations not as strangers, but as children of the great architect of the universe, worthy of respect and fair treatment. It is interesting to trace how Masonic principles were reflected in the business ethics of Siberian merchants. Honesty in business, keeping one's word, and fair treatment of employees were all part of the Merchant Code of Honor, which coincided remarkably with Masonic morality. Of course, not all merchants adhered to these high standards. There were also swindlers and cruel exploiters, but those who belonged to Masonic lodges had an additional incentive to conduct their business honestly. They were accountable not only to the law and public opinion, but also to their brothers in the lodge, to the great architect himself. Violating Masonic principles in business life would mean betraying the brotherhood, and that was unthinkable for a true Mason. The transmission of Masonic traditions within merchant dynasties often took place from father to son. When a young man from a merchant family reached maturity and began to participate in the family business, his father gradually introduced him to Masonic ideas. It was a form of initiation, the transmission of not only material inheritance, but also spiritual. Some researchers believe that it was in merchant families associated with Freemasonry that the traditions of Russian patronage originated, which would flourish later, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sava Morozov, Sergei Tretyakov, the Ryabushinsky brothers, all these outstanding patrons and collectors came from a merchant background, where Masonic ideas of serving society were passed down from generation to generation. The Masonic Brotherhood gave merchants something more than business connections or moral guidelines. It gave them the opportunity to feel part of a great historical process, heirs to ancient traditions dating back to the builders of Solomon's Temple. For a merchant who came from a peasant or petty bourgeois background and rose through his own labor and abilities, this was especially important. The Masonic Lodge put him on an equal footing with a hereditary nobleman, giving him status and recognition that he could not obtain in ordinary class society. In the Masonic Temple, a merchant was not just a wealthy trader, but a brother, equal among equals, whose opinion was valued no less than that of a prince or general. This social function of Freemasonry was perhaps no less important than its philosophical content. Charity and education were not just fine words in the mouths of Siberian Freemasons, but a real practice to which considerable resources and efforts were directed. Masonic philosophy taught that a true Freemason must not only work on his own spiritual improvement, but also work for the good of all humanity. This idea of serving society materialized in the creation of schools, hospitals, libraries, and shelters for orphans and the poor. In Siberia, where the state education and healthcare systems were extremely weak, such private initiatives were of enormous importance. How many lives were changed thanks to the schools opened with funds from Masonic merchants? How many lives were saved by the hospitals built with their donations? Education occupied a special place in the Masonic value system. The light of knowledge dispelling the darkness of ignorance was a central metaphor of Masonic philosophy. Freemasons believed that the enlightenment of the people was the key to transforming society, to the victory of reason over prejudice, of justice over arbitrariness. In Tomsk and Irkutsk, schools were opened with funds from members of Masonic lodges, where children of all classes could receive an education. This was a revolutionary idea at a time when education was considered a privilege of the nobility and clergy. Merchant and bourgeois children, peasant boys and girls were given the opportunity to learn to read, write, count, and learn the basics of geography, history, and natural sciences. Many teachers in these schools were themselves Freemasons or shared the Masonic ideals of education. The curriculum in Masonic schools was broad and modern. In addition to traditional subjects such as the law of God, Church Slavonic, and arithmetic, new subjects were also taught: natural history, physics, and foreign languages. Particular attention was paid to the moral education of students. They were instilled with the ideals of honesty, diligence, justice, and respect for human dignity, the very values that formed the basis of Masonic ethics. Of course, Masonic teachings were not openly preached in schools. That would have been impossible. But the spirit of Masonic philosophy permeated the entire education system, shaping the characters of future citizens in accordance with Enlightenment ideals. Libraries created by Freemasons served as centers of education and culture. In cities where the book trade was underdeveloped and there were no public libraries, private book collections open to the public became veritable treasure troves of knowledge. Merchant Freemasons ordered books from Moscow, St. Petersburg, and even from abroad. Libraries housed works by ancient philosophers, European Enlightenment thinkers, contemporary scientific literature, and works of art. Libraries became meeting places for the local intelligentsia, where discussions on literature, philosophy, and politics took place. Librarians, who were often Freemasons themselves, acted as informal mentors to young people, recommending books and guiding their reading. Hospitals and shelters established with Freemason funds were distinguished by a more humane attitude toward patients and the destitute than state institutions. Masonic ethics required seeing every suffering person as worthy of respect and compassion, regardless of their social status. Masonic doctors working in these hospitals treated the poor with the same attention as they did wealthy patients. In orphanages, children were not only provided with shelter and food, but also given an education, taught crafts, and prepared for independent life. This was a progressive approach that contrasted sharply with the cruelty of state-run orphanages of the time. How many children, rescued from poverty and homelessness, were able to become worthy members of society thanks to Masonic charity? The organization of charity in Masonic lodges followed certain principles. At each meeting, part of the time was devoted to discussing those in need and distributing aid. Strict accounting was kept on the receipt and expenditure of funds. There were special positions, alms distributors, school and hospital trustees. Assistance was provided not only in the form of money, but also through personal involvement. Brothers visited the sick, helped in the search for work, gave advice and moral support. This system of mutual aid operated not only within the lodge, but also extended to wider circles of society. Masonic charity was not a showy gesture made for public recognition. Often, assistance was provided anonymously, without publicity, following the Masonic principle of modesty and selflessness. The educational activities of the Freemasons went beyond formal education. They organized public lectures on various topics in science, history, and literature. They held literary and musical evenings where the works of the best composers and poets were performed. They created scientific societies to study Siberia, its natural resources, history, and ethnography. Many studies of the Siberian region in the first half of the 19th century were conducted with the support and participation of Freemasons. Their contribution to the development of culture and science in Siberia cannot be overestimated. It can be said that the Masonic movement created centers of civilization in this harsh region, from which the light of enlightenment gradually spread to the whole of society. The 1st of August 1822 became a black date in the history of Russian Freemasonry. Emperor Alexander I, who in his youth was himself interested in Masonic ideas and, according to some sources, was even initiated into a lodge, signed a rescript closing all Masonic lodges and secret societies in the Russian Empire. The reasons for this decision were complex and varied. The authorities feared that Masonic lodges had become a hotbed of liberal and even revolutionary ideas. The international connections of Freemasonry aroused suspicions of foreign influence. The closed nature and secrecy of the lodges seemed suspicious at a time when any form of social activity not controlled by the authorities was perceived as a potential threat. How did Siberian Freemasons react to this news? And what happened to the lodges after the imperial decree? Officially, the Tomsk Lodge Eastern Light ceased its activities in accordance with the imperial rescript. The last documented meeting took place in early August 1822. The minutes were sealed, and the lodge's seal, ritual objects, and library were to be handed over to the authorities or destroyed. Many documents did indeed disappear. They were burned or hidden so securely that they have not been found to this day. But did the formal closure of the lodge mean the actual cessation of Masonic activity? Historical evidence suggests that it did not. The Masonic Brotherhood was not an ordinary organization that could be closed with the stroke of a pen. It was a system of beliefs, a way of life, a network of personal connections that could not be destroyed by decree. People bound by Masonic oaths and beliefs continued to live in Tomsk and Irkutsk. They could not meet officially, perform rituals, or keep minutes, but they continued to meet in private homes under the guise of friendly visits, literary evenings, and business meetings. At these informal gatherings, they discussed the same issues as before at official lodge meetings. Philosophical discussions continued. Charitable activities did not stop, and young people continued to receive guidance from their older brothers. Freemasonry went underground and became even more secretive than before. The lack of documentation makes this phase of Siberian Freemasonry the least studied, but no less important. The Decembrist uprising of 1825 confirmed the authorities' worst fears about the connection between Freemasonry and revolutionary sentiments. Although the Decembrist secret societies themselves were not Masonic lodges, most of their leaders had undergone Masonic initiation and maintained ties with the Brotherhood. After the uprising was suppressed, the persecution of Freemasons intensified. Even a hint of connection with the banned order could lead to serious trouble. People who had previously been open about their membership in lodges now denied their membership, destroyed compromising documents, and tried to forget their Masonic past. But for true Masons, renouncing the Brotherhood was impossible. It would mean betraying their sacred vows. In the 1830s and 1840s, the Masonic movement in Russia, including Siberia, existed in the most secretive form possible. Old Masons, initiated before the ban, continued to pass on the tradition to selected disciples. These initiations did not take place in temples with full ritual decoration, but in an atmosphere of strict secrecy, often with the participation of only one initiator and one neophyte. Degrees were awarded on the basis of oral tradition, without written documents. Masonic literature was kept in hiding places and passed from hand to hand with the utmost caution. Nevertheless, the thread of tradition was not broken. When Freemasonry began to revive in Russia at the end of the 19th century, it turned out that in some cities, including those in Siberia, there were still people connected with pre-revolutionary Freemasonry. Interestingly, the ban on Freemasonry paradoxically contributed to the romanticization and mythologization of the movement. What was open or semi-open, having become forbidden, acquired a special appeal. Young people, prone to idealism and romanticism, saw in Freemasonry the embodiment of everything mysterious, noble, and sublime. The lack of real information about Freemasonry was filled with fantasies, legends, and rumors. In this atmosphere, literary works were created in which Freemasons were portrayed either as wise benefactors of humanity or as sinister conspirators controlling the fate of the world from the shadows. The reality was much more prosaic and at the same time more interesting than any fiction. The specific nature of Siberia was that state control was weaker here than in the European part of Russia. The vast distances, the small number of officials, and the special atmosphere of the region, where there was always more freedom and less formalism, created some opportunities for the continuation of Masonic activities. The police in Tomsk or Irkutsk were less vigilant than in St. Petersburg or Moscow. Local authorities were often aware of unofficial meetings, but turned a blind eye to them, understanding that these were respected members of society who were mainly involved in charity and cultural activities. This tolerance allowed the Masonic tradition to be preserved until better times. Despite the official ban and increased surveillance, Masonic ideas continued to live and develop in the minds of the Siberian intelligentsia. Underground Freemasonry in the second half of the 19th century differed significantly from the legal lodges of the first quarter of the century. It became more intimate, elitist, and cautious in its selection of new members. Whereas lodges had previously numbered dozens of brothers, now they consisted of small groups, sometimes of only 3 to 5 people, bound by ties of trust and mutual devotion. These small Masonic circles functioned as a kind of philosophical salon, where forbidden topics were discussed, banned books were read, and handwritten copies of Masonic texts were passed from hand to hand. Who were these people who risked their freedom to preserve an ancient tradition? The members of underground Masonic groups were predominantly representatives of the educated professions: doctors, teachers, engineers, and mid-level officials. These were people with university educations who knew foreign languages and read European philosophical literature. Many of them were educated at universities in the capital, where they came into contact with the remnants of the Masonic tradition, and then returned to Siberia, bringing new ideas with them. Some were the sons or grandsons of old Freemasons who had been initiated before the ban. From childhood, they had heard stories about Freemasonry, seen their fathers' books with mysterious symbols on the covers, and absorbed the atmosphere of a special way of thinking that distinguished Masonic families from ordinary ones. The connection between generations in underground Freemasonry was of particular importance. Old Freemasons who had been initiated into legal lodges before 1822 had become a rarity by the middle of the 19th century. Each such person was a living link to the golden age of Russian Freemasonry, a bearer of authentic tradition. Young enthusiasts sought out these old men, won their trust, and asked them to tell them about the old days, the rituals, and the philosophy of the Brotherhood. Sometimes an old Freemason would agree to perform a real initiation, passing on the tradition in its authentic form. More often, he limited himself to stories and passing on books, leaving the young man the right to decide for himself how to use the knowledge he had received. These meetings between generations took place in an atmosphere of strict secrecy, often unknown even to the close relatives of the participants. Masonic literature acquired special value during the underground era. Books that were legally published in the 18th and early 19th centuries now became bibliographic rarities. Possession of such a book could be dangerous, and it had to be carefully hidden. But even more valuable were handwritten texts, copies of rituals, philosophical treatises, and historical essays on Freemasonry. These manuscripts were copied by hand and passed from person to person, creating an underground network for the dissemination of knowledge. Some enthusiasts created entire home libraries of Masonic texts, risking serious trouble in the process. Were there secret archives in Siberia where documents of closed lodges were kept? Legends say yes, but so far, no such archive has been found. The philosophical content of underground Freemasonry underwent a certain evolution. Whereas mystical and ritualistic aspects had previously predominated, social philosophy now came to the fore. Underground Freemasons in the second half of the 19th century were more interested in questions of social structure, paths to social progress, and issues of justice and freedom than in alchemical symbolism and Kabbalistic speculation. This was natural in the era of Alexander II's Great Reforms, when all of Russia was discussing the peasant question, judicial reform, and local self-government. Masonic philosophy of enlightenment proved to be surprisingly in tune with the spirit of the times, offering ethical and theoretical foundations for social transformation. The connections between Siberian underground Freemasons and European Freemasonry were sporadic, but they did exist. Some Siberians who traveled abroad on business or for medical treatment visited lodges in Germany, France, and England. There they were initiated into recognized European orders, learned about the current state of the Masonic movement, and brought new ideas and contacts back to Russia. European Freemasons treated their Russian brothers, who were forced to operate in such unfavorable conditions, with interest and sympathy. Sometimes letters, books, and monetary donations for charitable projects were sent via diplomatic mail or by courier. These international connections strengthened Russian Freemasons in their activities and gave them a sense of belonging to a worldwide brotherhood. By the end of the 19th century, the situation began to change. Alexander III's reign was reactionary, but Freemasonry no longer seemed as serious a threat to the authorities as it had been before. New movements emerged that were more dangerous from the regime's point of view. Populists, socialists, anarchists. Against this backdrop, the Freemasons, with their vague philosophy and charitable projects, seemed almost harmless. Although there was no official permission for Masonic lodges, tacit tolerance was growing. At the beginning of the 20th century, during the era of the First Russian Revolution, Freemasonry began to revive openly, and it turned out that it had never completely died out. The thread of tradition, preserved underground, would allow organizational structures to be quickly restored. But that would be a completely different story, with different people and a different time. By the beginning of the 20th century, Siberia had become a developed region with large cities, industrial enterprises, universities, and theaters. The construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway in the 1890s opened up the region to mass migration and economic development. Tomsk became the largest educational center beyond the Urals with its Imperial University and Technological Institute. Irkutsk became the commercial capital of eastern Siberia. Novonikolayevsk, the future Novosibirsk, grew rapidly as a railway junction. A new intelligentsia was forming in these cities: professors, engineers, doctors, lawyers, journalists. Many of them were interested in the history of the region, studied archives, and collected the memories of old-timers. It was then that the process of rethinking the Masonic heritage in the history of Siberia began. Historians and local historians discovered that the Masonic movement had left a much deeper mark on the development of the region than previously thought. It turned out that many of Siberia's most important cultural and educational institutions were founded with the funds of Masonic merchants. Hospitals, schools, and libraries built in the first half of the 19th century continued to function and serve the community. The traditions of charity and patronage established by the Masons were passed on to subsequent generations of Siberian merchants. The descendants of those who belonged to lodges, often unaware of the Masonic past of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers, continued to engage in socially useful activities, guided by the same principles of service to society. The influence of Masonic ideas on the formation of the Siberian intelligentsia was significant, albeit elusive. A special attitude towards education, belief in the power of reason and science, the pursuit of social justice, cosmopolitanism, and tolerance towards different cultures and religions, all these traits, characteristic of the best representatives of the Siberian intelligentsia, had their roots in the Masonic philosophy of enlightenment. The Decembrists, who spent decades in Siberian exile, had a huge impact on local society, and much of this impact was transmitted through Masonic ideas and values. Young Siberians who interacted with the Decembrists absorbed not only specific political views, but also a more fundamental worldview in which Masonic ethics played an important role. The architectural heritage of Freemasonry in Siberia continued to attract the attention of researchers. At the beginning of the 20th century, the first works devoted to the symbolism of ancient buildings appeared. Architects and art historians began to systematically study the decorative elements of merchant mansions and public buildings, trying to decipher the messages embedded in them. It turned out that entire neighborhoods of Tomsk and Irkutsk were like a stone book, with pages written in the language of Masonic symbols. These discoveries sparked a lot of interest, not only in academic circles, but also among the educated public. Newspapers published articles about secret signs on building facades and conducted tours of Masonic sites in the city. The revolutionary events of 1905 and the subsequent easing of censorship allowed for more open discussion of previously forbidden topics. Liberal magazines published articles on the history of Russian Freemasonry, the memoirs of old Freemasons, and reprints of 18th-century Masonic texts. In Siberia, this movement manifested itself in the creation of historical and local history societies, which, among other things, studied the Masonic past of the region. Some members of these societies were descendants of old Masonic families and had access to family archives containing valuable documents and relics. Gradually, a more complete and objective picture of the role of Freemasonry in the history of Siberia began to emerge. Interestingly, at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, a revival of the Masonic movement began in Russia. Lodges began to be established again in St. Petersburg and Moscow, first semi-legally, and after 1905, almost openly. The authorities turned a blind eye to this, being preoccupied with more serious problems: the revolutionary movement, the war with Japan, and the internal political crisis. The new lodges included prominent politicians, State Duma deputies, well-known lawyers, writers, and scientists. Freemasonry became a kind of club for the liberal elite, who discussed ways to modernize Russia. Did this revival reach Siberia? There is no direct evidence of new lodges being established in Siberian cities in the pre-revolutionary years, but indirect evidence suggests that some Masonic activity did exist. The Masonic legacy in the history of Siberia is not only specific organizations and people, but also a certain tradition of thinking, a system of values, a cultural code that continued to operate even when the Masonic lodges themselves had long since closed. The ideas of enlightenment, humanism, religious tolerance, and social justice, which were introduced by Freemasons into Siberian society in the first half of the 19th century, continued to develop and transform in the following decades. They influenced the formation of a special Siberian character, more freedom-loving, democratic, and open to new ideas than in other regions of the empire. This cultural ferment played its part in the turbulent events of the early 20th century, when Siberia became the arena of grandiose social upheavals. Walking through the historic centers of Tomsk, Irkutsk, and Novosibirsk today, an attentive observer can discover traces of the Masonic past that have survived to this day. Despite the revolution of 1917, the Civil War, the Soviet period with its struggle against religion and mysticism, and the destruction of many historic buildings, Masonic symbols did not disappear completely. Many old mansions built by Masonic merchants in the 19th century have survived into the 21st century, bearing encrypted messages from the past on their facades. Modern local historians, architectural historians, and simply curious citizens continue to discover new examples of Masonic symbols in the urban environment. Each such discovery sparks debate. Is it really a Masonic symbol, or simply a decorative element to which people attribute a non-existent meaning? In Tomsk, the historic quarter around Lenin Avenue, formerly the Post Office Road, attracts particular attention. Here, wooden mansions from the mid and late 19th century have been preserved, many of which belong to merchant families associated with Freemasonry. On the carved window frames, cornices, and pediments, you can see geometric patterns that, upon closer inspection, turn out to be stylized Masonic symbols. Circles inscribed in triangles, intertwining lines forming a compass and a square, 5-pointed and 6-pointed stars. All these elements are present in the wooden lacework of Tomsk houses. The master carvers who carried out the merchants' orders may not always have understood the deeper meaning of the patterns they carved, following the wishes of their customers. In Irkutsk, Masonic symbols can be found on stone buildings from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Irkutskaya Gorka district is particularly interesting, where mansions built during the heyday of Irkutsk Freemasonry have been preserved. On the facades of these buildings, you can find classic Masonic emblems: the all-seeing eye in a triangle, columns with characteristic capitals, rays emanating from a central point. Some researchers believe that the layout of entire neighborhoods in Irkutsk follows Masonic geometry, where the location of streets and squares forms symbolic figures. This hypothesis is controversial and has no clear evidence, but its very existence shows how deeply the idea of Masonic presence in the city's history has penetrated. Novosibirsk, the youngest of the major Siberian cities, founded only at the end of the 19th century, also has its Masonic mysteries. Although the city emerged after the decline of classical Russian Freemasonry, some buildings from the early 20th century bear clear traces of Masonic symbolism. This may be due to the fact that the architects and clients who came to build the new city brought with them traditions and tastes formed in other places. Among the first builders of Novonikolayevsk were people from Tomsk, Irkutsk, Moscow, and St. Petersburg, cities with rich Masonic traditions. They reproduced the architectural forms they were familiar with, including elements of Masonic origin. Modern researchers of Masonic symbolism in Siberian architecture face methodological difficulties. The main problem is how to distinguish an intentionally placed Masonic symbol from a random decorative element. Triangles, circles, and stars are universal geometric figures that have been used in architecture throughout history and across cultures. Not all triangles are Masonic deltas. Not all stars refer to the pentagram of Freemasons. There is a danger of seeing Masonic signs where they do not exist, succumbing to the temptation of conspiratorial thinking. On the other hand, excessive skepticism can lead to truly significant symbols being dismissed as coincidental. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between and requires careful historical research of each specific case. Interest in the Masonic heritage of Siberia has experienced a resurgence in recent decades. The collapse of the Soviet Union, the opening of archives, and the general lifting of ideological taboos on the study of previously forbidden topics have all contributed to the intensification of research. Serious scientific works based on archival documents have appeared, memoirs and documents of 19th-century Siberian Freemasons have been published, and conferences and exhibitions are being organized. At the same time, popular literature on Freemasonry has emerged, often uncritical and sensational, attributing all kinds of secret influences and conspiracies to the Freemasons. This creates some confusion in the public consciousness, mixing fact with fiction. The Masonic heritage in Siberia is part of the region's cultural heritage, deserving of study and preservation. Buildings constructed by Freemasons or commissioned by them are architectural monuments that require protection and restoration. Documents and artifacts related to the Masonic movement should be stored in museums and archives and made available to researchers. The history of Masonic lodges in pre-revolutionary Siberia is the history of people who, despite all the difficulties and dangers, sought to make the world a better, more enlightened, and more just place. Their experiences, their ideals, their mistakes, and their achievements are all part of our shared history, the oblivion of which impoverishes our understanding of the past and of ourselves. Perhaps the stone messages left by Freemasons on the facades of Siberian buildings remind us of eternal values, the pursuit of knowledge, brotherhood, and service to society that are relevant in any era.